is Tim Stafford of Tim Stafford Restorations Inc. I've never done a YouTube video, but I decided to after getting contacted by someone on Facebook trying to build a motor, and found it impossible to try to explain to him over Facebook emails. He has no real access to mechanics where he's at. I guess the closest one was an hour-and-a-half flight away. So I figured I'd do a video on motor builds. And before I get into a motor build, I figured I'd do one on measurements. So let's start with the crankshaft, the most important piece of your motor. People generally neglect it. They figure they're just going to go into their motor and do a slinger cleaning, and usually there's some sort of issues with the crank. So I want to go over some measurements with you, but before I get started, you want a repair book. All this is a repair book for the most part, but there's information you learn as time goes by, so I figured I'd try to share that with everybody. Well, let's get back to the crank. The crank has to have large enough main journals front and rear for an interference fit on the main bearing. Yeah, I know this main bearing still has seals that needs to get popped out. But on the rear main, the journal needs to measure, and this is in inches, 1.3781, at least that size, and the front one, 1.3780. With the generator shaft, armature shaft at the front, if it's pre-/2, 0.669, and then the /2 ones would measure 0.7875. And that's for about a 0.5 thousandths to 1 thousandths interference fit, meaning the bearing has to press on. You also want to check the run out of your crank. That's why it's on the V-blocks, even if it's gone to a crankshaft builder. You're going to want the run out to be less than 1 thousandths front and rear. Sometimes I'll let the rear go 1.5 thou if the front is dialed in, but I will immediately check after getting the crank and the motor, get a flywheel on there and make sure the flywheel run out is good. The reason why I'll let it go 1.5 thou or so on the rear is sometimes they're just messy. You know, past owners have kind of messed up the ends and there's not much to measure there. And I assume if the front is that dang close that I'm just getting some noise or something on the back. And if I get a good flywheel run out, good. The other thing you're going to want to check, oh yeah, definitely check the run out, even though they get rebuilt, because a lot of the times in shipping, the cranks tend to settle or something. I don't think the builder is messing up. I think what it is the crank is under some sort of tension, and either heat or an impact or something, it just gets it to click into a spot you don't want it to be. So you've got to check that, and if you got to learn how to true them or send it back to the builder. But it's crucial. I've had them off a few times. Another thing you're going to want to do is make sure your wrist pin fit is good. And what is it? Yeah, it's a 0.5 thousandths to 1 thousandths clearance on the wrist pin. After that, you're going to want to also make sure your main bearing has an interference fit to your rear carrier as well as your front carrier of about a 0.5 thousandths interference fit, meaning this has to be a 0.5 thousandths smaller. Measure it in the case, because pressing this in the case squeezes it down a little bit. After I've taken care of measuring up the crank, I want to measure the cam follower, tappet bores. I've had motors that made noise. Factory spec on that is 1 thou to 1.5 thou. I've personally run ones that were 4 thousandths clearance, and this was on a motor that I was having problems with that had 17 thousandths clearance. We cleaned things up. We had some used parts. We were trying to get the guy on the road quickly, so we had used sleeves to press in there, and then bore to oversize cam followers. And one of them was slightly looser than I liked. It was the first one I had ever done. and it came out to 4 thousandths. In the end, the motor was absolutely the quietest motor I've ever built. I can't find any specs on allowable wear, but I personally will run a motor that's got 4 thousandths clearance. I just measured this one up and it's got 2 thousandths clearance, and that's outside the spec, and I know this motor's got very low miles on it. But check it. Most guys don't check this, and if they've got like 10, 15 thousandths clearance, it's gonna make some noise. Oil pump lash. You're gonna wanna get in there with your oil pump gear, get a little feeler gauge in there, and make sure you're about 4 to 10 thousandths clearance. If it's outside of 10 thousandths, you're gonna wanna look for new gears. Also, you're going to want to drop a straight edge across there and get a feeler, and what you're checking for is the distance between the gears and the case, and that should be 0.5 thousandths to 1.5 thou. One thing that's hard to find in any book is timing gear lash between the timing gears. Factory spec out of an old book called for 0.5 thou to 1 thou. That's set up new, I assume. I talked to a few of the guys. We don't think you're going to have a problem with these up to about 4 thousandths, but definitely check there for a lash. Piston clearance when you're reboring. We usually set all ours up at 3 to 3.5 thousandths clearance. If you're going to run it hard, sidecar use, sport model, 3.5 thousandths clearance. Spec on the pistons is actually tighter than that, but we like to get a little bit more, and quite a few mechanics I know like to go with that higher spec than factory was around 2.5 or so. One thing that gets overlooked a lot is rocker bushings. They're not going to be detrimental, but they're going to get noisy. There's only supposed to be 0.5 thousandths to 2 thousandths clearance between the bore of this and the shaft that it rides on. And that's, of course, for the bushing type. The S type, which uses needle bearings, no clearance. Yeah, it's supposed to be smooth, no rock. So just dead nuts. And the last thing I already touched on a little bit is once you get the flywheel in, checking the run out of the flywheel. You're going to want 4 thousandths run out or less. We used to not check this years ago, and I know some guys that still don't check this, but one time we had a motor or a bike, you pop it into gear and start creeping. We're like, what the heck's going on? And it had a rebuilt crank in it and so forth, but somehow, some way, the flywheel went on, and as it's going on, even though it's a taper, it went on slightly cocked. And this, we've noticed measuring after that, they will do that, and you have to be careful of it. And we had a 17 thousandths run out, so that flywheel was whipping around, moving back and forth, and you end up getting clutch drag. Learn how to set them up at 4 thousandths or less. That is about it for the measurements. There are other measurements, of course, you know, setting up heads and so forth, but these are some really fundamental ones deep in the motor, and I just wanted to go over those measurements with people. So get yourself, you know, some bore gauges, you know, and learn how to use them for checking. This is the one I use for the tappets, cam followers. It's one I use for rear main, and then of course the front main holder is the same. Other than that, can go over the rest when I'm building the motor. Thanks a lot.